הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות, על הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה, בזמן הזה שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stewart Ain. Every week we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community. And today we're going to be speaking with Efraim Zuroff. He's director of the Israel office for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And he's in Jerusalem. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Great. It's good to have you. And what we noticed, we spoke a few months ago with other people about the last German convicted of a war crime in Germany, and that was Bruno Day back in July of 2020. And shortly thereafter, about a month thereafter, the Wall Street Journal printed the story saying the era of Nazi trials comes to an end. I mean, they said it flat out. That's the end of it. We're never going to see any more. And you're basically the Nazi hunter for the Wiesenthal Center. You've been doing that for about 40 years, I guess, right? And do you think that's true? Is that the end? We're not going to see any more? There is still more out there.
No, of course there are. First of all, people have to understand that because of the extension of life expectancy, a lot of people are living to quite an elderly age, and most of the people who committed the crimes of the Holocaust live in countries like Austria and Germany, where the medical services are quite good. So I sometimes also say that people without a conscience maybe live longer. so that might also help. But there's no question that these people are reaching an elderly age and they're healthy enough to be brought to justice, which explains why a man of 93 years old, who was a watchtower guard in Stutthof, was put on trial. But there's one other element here that I'm not sure people are aware of, which is a very dramatic change in German prosecution policy. Until 2009, for a period of about 30 years, you had to prove that a perpetrator, suspect, had committed a specific crime against a specific victim and had done so motivated by racial hatred. Now, to be perfectly honest, it's almost impossible to prove that these days. But actually, because this change was made because of Demjanjuk, most people don't realize that. And it actually had a connection to 9/11, because some of the plotters in 9/11 were sitting in Hamburg and had no physical connection to the actual crime, but they had planned the crime. And the Germans were looking for a way to be able to prosecute them. Muhammad Atta, for example, one of the masterminds of 9/11, and they realized that these people could be prosecuted for accessory to murder, not for murder itself. And then two wonderful friends of mine, Kirsten Getze and Thomas Walter, who were working as prosecutors at the Central Office for the Clarification of Nazi War Crimes, said, 1 second, why don't we apply the same reasoning to people who served in death camps, for example, like Demjanjuk? And that case was the test case for this change. And once Demjanjuk was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years or 5 years in prison, the German authorities began looking for any person who had served initially in the death camp, and later on they expanded that to anyone who served in a camp where there was a gas chamber or means for mass annihilation. And there have already been 4 successful trials. A 5th trial was stopped because of health reasons of Johannes Rehbogen, who served in Stutthof. That's a camp near Gdansk, the first concentration camp built outside of Germany, a place in which 65,000 people died, were murdered or died of the conditions. And the last trial was also of a guard from Stutthof, Bruno Day, who had been a watchtower guard in Stutthof. But
Right.
there are a lot of additional investigations going on. And, you know, journalists love to say this is the last, the last trial. And Lawrence Douglas is not a journalist. He's actually a very respected law professor in Amherst. And I think he's written a wonderful book about the Demjanjuk trial. But I would just like to remind him, if he's listening, that in 1989, Joseph Schwamberger, who is the commander of 3 forced labor camps in Poland, Roswitha, Melitz, and Przemysl, was extradited from Argentina with our help, I have to say, with Wiesenthal Center's help, to stand trial. It was the first trial in unified Germany. And a person wrote a book, someone wrote a book entitled The Last Nazi. Well, that's a bit of a joke because more than 100, there have been legal decisions against more than 100 Nazi war criminals since Schwamberger's case.
Now, there are currently, what, about a half dozen people who are now under investigation or you're doing work on. Is that right? It's more?
There's more. There are at least 14 cases that are under investigation, and they're primarily from Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald. There's a case from Mauthausen. There's another case, should be very interesting, of the woman who is the secretary to the commander of Stutthof, and she was in the camp for the entire course of the camp's existence. From 43 to 45, she was the secretary for the of Hoppe, for the commandant of Stutthof. And her trial will be very interesting. I'm just hoping that she, you know, I'm the only Jew in the world who prays for the good health of Nazis. So I'm praying every day that she remains in good health so she can be brought to justice.
Would Bruno Day be a witness? This is the man who was just convicted. He also served at Stutthof.
I don't know. I'm not privy to that information. It might happen, but they might use testimony of his, for example, from the trial at Stutthof.
Right. How long do the trials usually go? Just
Okay.
a few days?
I was at the opening of the trial. The opening of the trial took place on Chol HaMoed Sukkot, which was in October of 2019. And it was completed, the verdict was rendered July 23rd, 2020. Now, to the credit of the German courts, this trial continued despite the COVID-19 and despite various restrictions. So thank God that happened, because my fear was that, first of all, the people who might be brought to trial, the people at risk, number one, and the longer that it takes, the greater the possibility that these people won't make it to the trial.
Sure.
To a trial.
Yes. Now, of course, he was only 17 at the time that he served there, and
he began his service. He was 17 at the time he began the service.
Began to serve.
And that's why he was tried in a juvenile court, and that had an impact on his ultimate verdict.
Well, he was found guilty, and he was basically given a suspended sentence, right? 2 years.
2 years. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. There was a suspended sentence, a fact which I have to say absolutely infuriated me. And the irony of the story is that Judge Maya Goring, who was the chief judge here and the person who conducted this trial in an exemplary manner, in my opinion, wrote an absolutely brilliant verdict. In terms of all the arguments, she refuted every single argument that has traditionally been presented when someone of this age is, and of this rank is brought to justice. In other words, she ripped the age issue to shreds at two ends. The age, number one, when he was a guard, and the age, his current age. The whole business of saying he was only a small cog in a much larger machinery tore that to pieces in a absolutely brilliant way. I read the verdict after I knew what the sentence had been, and I was in shock. I was really shocked by the discrepancy, by the contradiction between her brilliant analysis of the issue, why it's so important, and the decision. In other words, I said to myself, half jokingly, maybe we could find another watchtower that he could go into, because you know that a suspended sentence means if he commits the crime again, then they'll implement the sentence. So I was looking for a way to implement the sentence, but it's not available.
Not available. He's 93 years old, but there have been others who have been convicted, and I guess what now what's his name? The accountant of Auschwitz.
Oscar Groening.
Oscar Groening. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Were you at that trial?
No, I was at the day trial several times, for the opening and also in the middle of the trial, when I heard a fantastic testimony by a survivor from living in Australia, in Melbourne, which was provided by Skype. And it immediately struck me. Helena Strand was a woman, she's 93 years old. Her memory was crystal clear. The details that she provided for the court, for the judges in the trial, were really very, very clear and very, very dramatic. Her mother died in her arms during the typhus epidemic. And she was a wonderful, wonderful witness. And I said, and I wrote actually in an op-ed in the Times of Israel, here, listen, she's 93, Bruno Day is 93. Why on earth should we not prosecute Bruno Day, who's healthy enough to stand trial? And why not hear the testimony of Helena Strand, who gave a wonderful testimony, full details, and very impressive.
At the Oscar Groening trial, a survivor came up to Oscar during a break, and
kissed him.
Started to speak with him. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Eva Kor, of course.
So I called Effa, and I said, "What are you doing? What did I just see you do?" And she said, "Well, I just want him to let him know that I forgive him." And but she is unique. There weren't too many other survivors who said that. She said she did it for herself. She did it so she could live. It wasn't so she wasn't speaking for anybody else. Can you understand that?
Listen, she can speak for herself is one thing, but basically she's doing this to spread a message that is very, very counterproductive. Because if forgiveness is given by survivors to people who committed the crimes of the Holocaust, why bother prosecuting them? And I don't know if you saw the movie. There's a very good documentary called The Trial of the Accountant of Auschwitz. It's done by a group of Canadian filmmakers. They did a wonderful job. And I participated I was interviewed by a Holocaust educational group called Classrooms Without Borders in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that arose was precisely this question, the question that you're asking. So I was extremely negative about what Eva Kor has done, and I've been negative again. I've been against it from the very beginning, but until recently, I never said anything. But this struck me, I have to say, to be perfectly honest, as a cheap publicity stunt. And there was a stunt to promote her approach to this issue. Now, she doesn't represent the survivors, and she didn't say to the camera, "I'm doing this only for myself." And it could be interpreted as some sort of panacea for the issue of Holocaust memory. Now, I was attacked like you can't believe. She has a whole bunch of acolytes, people who are enamored with her approach. But this is a Christian approach. This is not the Jewish approach. You know, it's not the kiss and tell Judaism. It's
right.
Justice. And justice is extremely, extremely important even today, even after so many years. And to come and hug him and kiss him, God Almighty, terrible, absolutely terrible. But, you know, listen, normally I would never attack a survivor. I'm not in their place. I didn't undergo the terrible things that they underwent. But having said that, here, this is something with very, very broad implications. which, if accepted and supported, would be terribly counterproductive.
I haven't met any other survivor who has taken that approach. Have you?
No, never,
No,
never.
no,
And for
no.
good reason.
Yes, yes. And
No, it pains me. It pains me because I know that there are people, naive, simple people who actually are enamored by this. This is so wonderful. You know, it's like, in a certain sense, it's erasing the Holocaust. And they don't want to do that. And I'm sure Evercore also didn't want to do that. But that's,
No.
in practice, that is what it's doing. It's erasing the crimes. And Holocaust without the crimes is nothing, obviously.
you worked for the OSI, the Office of Special Investigation.
Israel, the OSI.
Right, for 6 years or so. And then you went back to the Wiesenthal Center. When you were working for the OSI, you were trying to find if there were any Nazis who had come to the United States under false pretenses, and you're also trying to find Mengele as well?
Okay, so I didn't have to find the Nazis. The OSI was doing a very good job in identifying these people. My job was to try and find potential witnesses from the places where these people had committed their crimes, try and find documents in Yad Vashem and in other, I mean, I went all over Israel to Lochamei Ghetto Fighters House. I went to Moreshet Archives, Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan University, wherever there were testimonies. And I perused all that material, anything that could possibly be connected. But the irony of the story was that there was very little information in Israel, very few documents, which actually could be used in a trial. In the 6 years that I worked for the OSI, I only found one document that could be presented at a trial. It was a document signed by the mayor of Kovna, Palchauskas, Kazis Palchauskas, who ordered the Jews into the ghetto. And that document was found in Israel. And in the end, I'm not even sure it was actually submitted to the trial. And that was there was a source of a lot of frustration, I have to say. But having said that, as far as Mengele goes, the OSI was asked to investigate a piece of information which was quite amazing, quite shocking. In 1985, the Wiesenthal Center, and I, at this point, was working for the OSI, not for them anymore. I had returned to Israel, which was my original idea. That's what I had come to America to get material for my doctorate about the Vad Hatzalah, which was the Orthodox Rabbis Rescue Committee in America. In any event, they asked the National Archives in the United States for any and all evidence documents relating to Joseph Mengele and the known pseudonyms, etc. And they received a letter signed by an American counterintelligence officer named Benjamin Gorby, whose name was actually Goldstein, and he was a Palestinian Jew. And he wrote to his superior that according to an informant, the American army had arrested and released Dr. Joseph Mengele near Vienna in late 1946. And the letter, if I remember correctly, was dated January 47. Now, the Wiesenthal Center was absolutely shocked by this information, and they made a big scandal out of it, as you can imagine. And William French Smith, who was the Attorney General at the time, made 3 decisions. One, the U.S. Marshals will now start actually looking for Joseph Mengele, because no one knew where he was. No one knew what had happened to him. 2, the United States will investigate whether Joseph Mengele ever entered the United States, because at this point, it was already clear that many Nazi war criminals had entered the United States.
Some with government help.
Some with government help, undoubtedly. And 3rd, they asked the OSI to investigate whether or not this information was actually true. Now, the assignment that I received from my friend David Marwell, he was my boss at OSI. He wrote the book on Mengele now, the recent book on Mengele, was to try and find the survivor, or the informant, who it turns out they knew that he was a survivor from the Lodz Ghetto. The last deportations to Auschwitz were from the Lodz Ghetto in the fall of 1944. named David Freiman. He worked in Mengeler's clinic. Now, it was his job. He was sent to Auschwitz, and he was sent straight to Mengeler's clinic to work there. So, in other words, he knew Mengele. He saw him on a daily basis. But the question was, how do we find him? So David Silberklein, who's the very well-known Holocaust historian, he was for many years the editor of Yad Vashem Studies, suggested to me, I did most of my work at Yad Vashem, he suggested, why don't you look in the files of the International Tracing Service? Now, this is very interesting. I had never used that archives because I thought that this simply the names of Jews who had survived or who were victims of the Shoah, and I was looking for the criminals, not for the Jews. And in addition, what was also very interesting was the material was in the hands of a consortium of 11 different countries. The originals were in Germany in a place called Arelsen, sometimes referred to as the Arelsen Archives. Mm-hmm. Everywhere except Israel, there was no access, unless you were asking about a first-degree relative. In other words, if I had written to Arelsen and said, I want to know what happened to my father, or let's say my grandfather,
it's closed.
They would answer me in 6 to 9 months, something like this. If I said I'm working for the U.S. Justice Department and I'm looking for Nazis, they wouldn't have answered. Only in Israel was that place available to the public. Okay, so I went looking for David Freiman. Now, one of the interesting things was the material was organized in according to a phonetic alphabet, not according to the regular alphabet. So it took me about an hour to get the hang of it, and that hour changed my life, really. In other words, what does that mean? It means that double letters count as single letters. V and W are considered the same letter. I, J, and Y are also considered the same letter. So I'm going through looking for poor David Freiman, and I see that most of the people mentioned here, they're non-Jews. They registered as refugees. They were living in displaced persons camps. So I go, one second. The Nazis who came to the Anglo-Saxon countries, who came to the United States, for example, almost all of them had registered as refugees with the Red Cross to get refugee privileges and had emigrated to the United States from DP camps. Now, there was no indication on the cards whether any of these people was a Nazi war criminal, but they had the immigration destinations, the boat they sailed on, the date they sailed, and those who went to the United States had a first address even. Now, it had people who went to Australia, it had people who went to Canada, to New Zealand. Now, this was, I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, this was like a gold mine. But just to check, just to be sure I wasn't having delusions, I made up a list of 49 Lithuanians and Latvians who I knew were Nazi war criminals. And I went looking for them. In a matter of minutes, I found the immigration destinations of 16 of them. Now, you have to understand at that time what the situation was. Of all the Anglo-Saxon countries, the only one which had already decided to take legal action against Nazi war criminals living there was the United States. That was the OSI. Canada and Australia were investigating. They still hadn't made up their minds. Britain and New Zealand didn't have a clue that they had a problem. Now, while I was working for the Americans, so what interested the Americans were the ones who went to the United States. But here we had a historic opportunity to flood the other 4 countries with the names of suspects in order to convince them that they too had to take legal action. They had to set up a special office. And I contacted Rabbi Haya of the Wiesenthal Center, and I had made a suggestion to him about setting up a database of all the Nazi war criminals, and suggested that to him as a project. He all of a sudden he got back to me and said, okay, I want to do it. I said, forget about it. We have to go for the jugular now. We have to convince all the other Anglo-Saxon democracies that have the problem to set up, take legal action. And that's what we did. I left the Justice Department for the Americans. Someone continued another 11 years after me in Israel. And I started making the lists. So the first list was, for example, 40 suspects who went to Australia. then a list to England, 17, then 26 to Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the good news is that Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, and Great Britain in 1991 all passed special laws in their parliaments to enable the criminal prosecution of Nazi war criminals, unlike the situation in America, where the Nazis were tried not for the crimes in the Shoah, but for the immigration and naturalization violations of lying on their applications, because the crimes were committed outside the United States. The victims were not Americans, so they would have had to change the law in 2/3 of the 50 states, which would have taken years. So they went, I call it the Al Capone compromise. They went the same way that Al Capone was tried for income tax evasion.
Right.
These people were tried for immigration and naturalization violations. And they could be stripped of their citizenship, then they could be deported or extradited if someone wanted them. But that was what I did. That basically turned me into a Nazi hunter. In other words, I was still, thinking to myself, I'm going to end up in some university teaching Holocaust.
Well, the interesting now that.
By the way, 1 second, I have to add one point. I mean, if you're wondering what happened to Mengele, once the Americans started looking for him, the Germans joined in, Israel joined in, and they finally carried out a search in the home of Hans Seidelmeyer, who was the high official of the Mengele concern, which they make agricultural equipment. And they discovered there the correspondence between Joseph Mengele and his family. And it emerged that Mengele had died of a stroke while swimming in the Atlantic Ocean on February 7th, 1979. So in other words, he was long dead. And the question I always asked myself was, why didn't they do this search not in 1986, but in 1976 or 1966, when Mengele was still alive? It would have been one of the most important trials of Nazi war criminals. He's a symbol of the perversion of science, of medicine, betrayed his Hippocratic oath. And the answer is, and this is something that has plagued us throughout the entire effort, lack of political will. If there's no political will to bring these people to justice, it won't happen.
But for the last 2 years, you've been trying to find others who were younger in the Nazi mobile killing units. Can you talk about that? And you've had some success.
Sure. Okay. So when after Demjanjuk was convicted, I went to Ludwigsburg, where the central office for the clarification of Nazi war crimes is located. It's near Stuttgart. I met with them and I said, listen, the same reasoning by which you brought Demjanjuk to trial, you can bring Einsatzgruppen people to trial. So they said, we know. But the problem was they never found any. And I found at least four, which I brought to the attention of the authorities in Germany. And unfortunately, there were some problems with the investigation. And unfortunately, none of them has been brought to justice. There's still one case, which is still open. But I mean, the problem is that the cases are not being expedited, and the cases are started by the experts in Ludwigsburg. Then they're turned over to the local prosecution near where the suspect lives. And that's a crapshoot. You know what I mean? You can get someone who's super dedicated. You can get someone who doesn't care. And, that's what we're up against. So.
But the hunt continues.
The hunt continues, definitely. Definitely. No question.
Right. And you do believe there'll be additional trials?
There will be more trials. Listen, this woman from Stuttgart, for example, I found, to help the prosecution, I found more than 20 survivors of Stuttgart, most of whom lived in Israel, because the Jews who were sent to Stuttgart were mostly from the ghettos of Lithuania and a little bit from Latvia, and people from Hungary who arrived at Auschwitz, and Auschwitz couldn't kill them. So they were sent to Stuttgart to be mistreated there.
You've been able to really concentrate on finding these Nazi war criminals and convincing, all of the countries in Europe that were occupied at one point by the Nazis to actually conduct trials. And something like 40,000 trials were conducted, or is that right?
I think the number is much higher. because you have to remember that those countries which became part of the Soviet Union or were under communism prosecuted thousands and thousands of them. If there's one good thing that you could say about the Soviet Union, it's probably the only thing, is that they took the collaboration with the Nazis very seriously, and they put on trial thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people throughout the region. That was, of course, it was done also for political reasons, because Nazism was the exact antithesis of communism, and they viewed the World War II as a battle of the ideological titans of communism against Nazism.
Right. And now, something like, they say 5,000 German and Austrian nationals have been convicted of complicity in some role in connection with the Nazi war effort. Is that right?
More. In Germany alone, until 1985, there were 7,000 convictions.
Oh.
But believe it or not, that's based on 120,000 indictments. In other words, there were 200,000 investigations, 120,000 indictments, and only 7,000 people actually punished.
What do you say to those who say, look, they're old men now, let them die in peace. Why are we doing this? What do you say?
I say to them, when you look at these people, don't see old, frail men in front of you. Think of someone who, at the peak of their physical powers and their energy, devoted all their efforts to the mass murder of innocent people, some of whom were older than they are today. I mean, we have testimonies of people over 100 arriving in Auschwitz, being deported to Auschwitz from Hungary, for example. And I mean, these people are the last people on earth who deserve any sympathy. They had no sympathy for their victims. And contrary to what most people think, the Germans and the Austrians had a choice. They did not have to carry out the executions. And there's no single case documented of a German or Austrian who was executed for refusing to kill Jews.
Or serve in these, in the military?
No, listen, a lot of people were drafted. So of course they had to go the same way people are drafted all over the world.
Right.
But the specific task of the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children, again and again, the commanders told them, if there's someone here who can't do it, doesn't want to do it, they don't have to do it. And if you read Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, for example, about Police Battalion 101, and the historians looked specifically to find cases like this to understand whether or not people had a choice. And the same was true outside for the collaborators in the Baltic countries and elsewhere. They did not have to do it, and there were quite a few people who chose not to do it.
Including the people drafted, including the army people.
Including people who were drafted, including people who even volunteered to serve. Let's say they volunteered to serve in the SS. And then they they were assigned to the Einsatzgruppe, and they saw what's going on. There were some people who said, I can't do that. I can't shoot women and children or whatever. I can't shoot the elderly.
Talk about these mobile death units that the Nazis set up, the ones that the people who were involved in these operations, the ones you're going after now. You talk about those. Those were set up where? Mostly in Russia?
They were sent to accompany the Wehrmacht, the German army, when it invaded the Soviet Union, which was actually Eastern Poland. In other words, the third of Poland that had been occupied by the Russians. That's where the border was, between Nazi Germany or Nazi-occupied Poland and Russian-occupied Poland. They accompanied the troops as they entered the Soviet Union in something called Operation Barbarossa. It was the biggest invasion ever in military history. And they followed the troops, and in the areas that were liberated, they immediately started organizing the mass murders. Now, one thing that is very important to understand. Only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. In other words, everywhere in Europe The countries occupied by Nazi Germany or allied with Nazi Germany, the Nazis tried to enlist local helpers. And there were three reasons for it. One was ideological, two were practical. Ideological is they wanted to show that the local population supports the measures they're taking against the quote unquote enemies of the Reich, primarily Jews, but not only Jews, communists, mentally ill, handicapped, etc., Jehovah's Witnesses. The two other reasons, one was they were short on manpower. Okay, they controlled an area from the gates of Moscow, the gates of Leningrad, all the way to Normandy, from Narvik and Trondheim in northern Norway to the Greek islands, and everywhere except Britain, of course, and the neutrals. In other words, Spain and Portugal, Turkey, Ireland, Switzerland,
right.
Sweden. So, in other words, that entire area was under their control. They're about to launch an unprecedented mass murder operation. And in the beginning, you're not talking about gas chambers. This is not stuffing 150 people into a gas chamber and murdering them in a matter of minutes. This is individual murder. And I'll give you an example. In Lithuania, I just published a book not long ago on Lithuanian complicity in the Holocaust called Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust. There were less than 1,000 Germans during the Nazi occupation of Lithuania. 220,000 Jews lived in Lithuania during the Nazi occupation, of whom 212,000 were murdered. 90% of them were murdered by shooting near their homes, in forests, right near where they lived, individually shot, men, women, and children. How do you pull off a thing like that? You need massive assistance from the local collaborators. And in Lithuania, that's what happened. And the tragedy now, and what I'm fighting against this for years, is that the narrative of Lithuania is the Holocaust was a terrible tragedy. The Nazis came in, murdered our Jews. 1 second. They murdered your Jews, only them? You know what? There were a few marginal elements in Lithuanian society, degenerates. They're not part of us.
Babi Yar, same situation.
Exactly.
Everybody was shot.
Exactly the
Everybody
same.
was shot.
33,771 victims. And how do I know the number? The bodies were exhumed by the Soviets. September 29th, 30th, 1941. And for years, by the way, there was no mark on this spot. And then some genius in the Kiev municipality wanted to build a football stadium there.
Yeah.
So Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the famous Russian poet, non-Jewish, published his poem, Babi Yar, a cry on behalf of the victims, and they dropped the idea. And there was a little monument to the victims of fascism.
And you're saying there are no bodies there anymore?
No, the bodies are there. The bodies are there. No, what I'm saying is there was nothing to mark the spot. There was
but I thought, did you say that they dug up some bodies?
No, they exhumed. They did an exhumation to estimate the number of victims, but then they covered it up.
And then they covered it up, right?
Russians did it. The Soviets did it in several places. It wasn't only in Babi Yar, but.
And Babi Yar, it's just a ravine. I've been there, and as you said, there's no marker, but they're talking about now building a monument. Natan Sharansky is heading this group that's going to. Are you familiar with that?
Of course, I'm familiar with it. But I'm telling you, Ukraine and Lithuania are the major offenders in terms of Holocaust distortion. And the book I wrote this book with a Lithuanian author, non-Jewish Lithuanian author, who discovered that her uncle and her grandfather were involved in the killings, in the murder of Jews. And she was looking for a way to atone for this. Her name is Ruta Vanagaita. And we went on a mission to 40 places. In Lithuania, there's 234 Holocaust graves. We went to 35 in Lithuania and 5 in Belarus, where a Lithuanian unit was sent by the Nazis to murder Jews in Belarus. They murdered 20,000 Jews in 15 months, in 41 and 42. And we went to see, can you find the places? So we found almost every place. Are they marked? Some aren't, a few aren't, but are they neglected? Undoubtedly. And we went to local museums. We went to Panovich, the famous city of Panovich with its great yeshiva. I asked the person in charge of PR in the museum, I said to him, is there anything here about the community? 7,000 Jews murdered. He says, no. I said, are you aware of the fact that millions of people all over the world know the name of your city? He goes, why? I said, you know the bakery opposite the bus station? That's the edifice of the Panovich Yeshiva. And I explained to him what yeshiva is and you know why it's important. And it was rebuilt in Israel, Rabbi Kahneman, the whole story. He was in shock. I said to Ruta, I said, they murdered us, they inherited us, and they erased us. So this is the book. The book created a huge scandal in Lithuania. It came out first in Lithuanian, and ultimately my co-author had to flee Lithuania because she was under threat for doing what she did. In other words, she said, "Oh, you must work for the Russians. You must be Putin's agent, or you work for the Jews, or you're getting paid by both of them."
And she said, "No, I'm the relative of the people who did this."
This was an enormous shock, absolutely enormous shock in Lithuania. The book became a bestseller, but later on, they took revenge against her because she questioned some initiative of the government, and they got the publishers to take all her books out of the bookstores a day after she launched an autobiography. So 27,000 copies were removed, and no one will buy her books.
No.
And she ran away to Israel she was in Israel for 3 years, just to escape. The father of Lithuanian independence, Landsbergis, wrote in an op-ed that now that you've betrayed the country, why don't you just go commit suicide?
The people don't want to remember, they don't want to acknowledge, they don't want to what?
Listen, there are some people who do, very few, and there are even Lithuanian historians who wrote the truth more or less about the Holocaust, but no one reads it. It's academic scholarship. It has had absolutely no impact or effect on the government. The government narrative is nothing to do with us. Tragedy, terrible, boo-hoo-hoo, we lost our Jews. But Stewart, I don't want to be too much of a self-promoter, but the book just came out in English now. It's called Our People. And the picture on the cover is of two faces. One of a Jew who represented Lithuania in 2 Olympics as a cyclist, 24 and 28, Yitzhak Anolik, and one of the murderers. And they look more or less similar. So Ruta says about the Jewish cyclist, she said, good enough to represent us in the Olympics, not good enough to live. Murdered in the Kovna ghetto. The murderer was in Ponar, where they murdered 70,000 Jews.
There have been a number of movies about you and your activities. Are there any on Netflix, or can we see them?
I'll tell you, the movie, the trial of the accountant of Auschwitz is on Netflix.
What's that name? The accountant of Auschwitz is on
Trial of the
Netflix.
accountant of Auschwitz.
Okay, Oscar Groening. Right. Okay. Great. Well, we'll have
That's
to.
my Netflix, and I think, I'm not sure, there's a series by the BBC called The Last Nazis. And one episode is about my search for Dr. Aribert Haim, who was a notorious sadist at Mauthausen. Like he was like a mini Mengele. And I went to South America to try and find him. So they followed me, and they did a great job. It was probably the best movie ever made about me.
Oh,
So,
wow. Well, thank you so much. We've been speaking with Efraim Zuroff from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. My name is Stewart Ain. This has been Jewish Life, and my producer is Jason Ain. Thanks very much. Until next week, we'll see you.